Yes. I'm feeling like Michael Jackson with this fancy microphone. It's cool. Well, hello, everyone. This paper is the result of a research that I have been working in for 5 years under the supervision of Dr. Raquel Pelta for my PhD. In this investigation, my main focus has been on the construction of the theories published by Vox and other authors on the idea of Graphie Latine, in a period where the ideas of the Swiss International School was expanding all over the world. The main objective of this research is, on the one hand, to put this movement into history, as it's a movement that is particularly unknown. And in the second hand, my objective is to show how the story of graphic design and typography history is not linear. The history of graphic design and typography has been told principally from the vision of modern design. But there were movements that were opposed to it in different places and in different moments. One of them, and this is the particular story that I will tell to you today, is the Graphie Latine, which took place in France and developed from 1950 to 1965. So, maybe you think you know who was Maximilien Vox, really? I have to say, no, you don't. So, begin with it, I would like to introduce Maximilien Vox. Maximilien Vox was an illustrator and a wood engraver, but also editor and graphic designer and typographer. He also collaborates with various publications during his youth. As draftsman, he was the editorial secretary of the satirical anti-republican magazine Le Mot in 1914. He was also the artistic advisor of de Berny-Peignot at the interwar period. He designed the standard typography for the French Railways Company. He was the artistic director of the Ministry of Information during the Vichy government of the occupied France by the Nazis. And he was also a writer of a large number of texts about typography, mainly. A polyphacetic man. But he is essentially internationally known for his classification, which is only one piece of his theories concerning the Graphie Latine. But what was the context? From the interwar period, the French typography market from the middle of the last century was dominated by 3 big type foundries: de Berny-Peignot, la Fonderie Olive in Marseille, and the Fonderie Typographique Française. As it happened with most of the European and American foundries, the French ones focused their effort in the production of display typefaces for publicity and advertising, due to the big demand and the immediate profitability. In France, most of the text typefaces came from abroad, from the foreign foundries, or they were limited to the traditional creations, such Garamond or Didot. The French foundries didn't consider profitable to develop new text typefaces due to the high cost of production and the risk of their commercialization. So, they concentrate themselves in the development of the scripts and the revival of the ancient catalogs, where some of the types came from the beginning of the 19th century. It is in this context that the Graphie Latine appears. But what was exactly the Graphie Latine? The Graphie Latine was a movement of a traditionalist nature within the French typography school of thought, a movement that was opposed to the avant-garde movements and the modern design, which had its roots, in Vox's opinion, in the German Bauhaus. The Graphie Latine movement emerged in France for the following reasons. The market for ink pressure and the decline of the French-owned production, and the technological advance to the phototypesetting that threatens to get rid of 5 centuries of typography tradition. This is one of the first phototypesetting machines, the Lumitype Photon from 1951. This is a picture from the Musée de l'Imprimerie de Lyon. His main objective was then to restore the confidence to the printing professionals and to the French typography facing an uncertain scene. That's the reason why they used the Rencontres de Lure, the Encounters of Lure, and the magazines Caractère and Caractère Noël as their tools of dissemination in order to spread their message, and everything was orchestrated by Maximilien Vox during almost 15 years. So, what were the main basic principles of the Graphie Latine? For the Graphie Latine, typography was an intellectual field, as it was considered as an artistic discipline and as the intrinsic vehicle to knowledge, opposed to the functionalist materialism of the modernism. Latinity means universality. As Jordan explained at the Penrose Annual in 1954, open quote, by Latinity, Maximilien Vox meant the soul of Christianity, which led to the making of Europe and by which we have our life, our movement, and our being, end of quote. They considered the Latin alphabet at the basis of the Western culture. The paradox in this idea was that it came out from a French nationalist conception, since they refused the modern internationalism, arguing that it didn't correspond at all to a Latin spirit. They enacted a protectionist attitude into the French graphic design, facing the propulsion of foreign influences. In opposition to those influences, they defended the sensitivity and the drawing, opposite to the coldness and the modern geometry. The main battlefield on this idea was the recovery of the spirit of the Latin typefaces of the 19th century, according to the classification of Francis Thibaudot from 1921. They are the Latins described by Thibaudot in his book, 1921. In opposition to the foreign sans serif ones. Therefore, the starting point to the recovery of Latinity to the contemporary design scene, according to the French Graphie Latine, should be the recovery of the Roman inscriptions. As for the French movement, the Roman lettering represented the zenith of the Latin letter in all its magnificence. They would argue that Latinity was the result of all the wisdom filtered by tradition, from which, nevertheless, it was necessary to banish the routines and the useless conventions. The old models should not be recovered as a whole, but should be taken as the basis to create new typefaces. They will assert that in order to make advantage of the photoelectric typesetting, the machines should submit to the criteria legated by the traditional typographic classicism. This, in their opinion, will prevent to substitute the humanism, the sensitivity, and the creative Latin spirit to mechanic coldness and impersonal of what the École de Lure will name the robots, on his little French typographer trying to evangelize Rob the robot. Those were the 6 basic principles of the Graphie Latine, which, as we can see, are essentially opposed to those claimed by modernism. So, which are precisely the reasons of the Graphie Latine to be against modernism? In first instance, they could not meet a position that could suppose a breakout with tradition. They thought that to learn from the legacy of the past was the only manner in order to evaluate and to create something new. They refused the modern ideas not only because they were against to break up with tradition, but also because they were coming from abroad, mainly. And specifically because the avant-garde ideas arise from a German context. And here we have the Latin army fighting the ugly modern German barbarians. What means that those ideas were non-Latin and therefore could not be adopted into a cultural context that was completely different, and that couldn't correspond to it. There was the need to redefine the French internal market. Cheese, but anyway. Therefore, any foreign influence that will break the glorious legacy of the French typography, cheese market, was considered a threat to her re-establishment. In order to recover the French typography, the only valid reference should be and was the French typography herself. For them, typography was an art related to drawing, although without any relation with calligraphy and to the expressive sensitivity. That's why they refuse the geometric abstraction and the functionalist inexpressiveness that the modern movement defend. In opposition, they thought that drawing letters correspond with the Latin spirit, the French one, of course. Here we are, a proud Frenchman facing his geometric modern brother-in-law. In this respect, they refused lineals, the sans serifs, too geometrical as the neo-grotesque. They considered they were letters that were not drawn, but constructed. For them, they came from a mathematical rationalism completely distant from the Latin humanism. For all these reasons, they proposed, as a contemporary alternative to the lineals, sans serifs, the model of the incis, the glyphics. Those last ones were, on their opinion, at the same time the interpretation of the French traditional Latin letters and the Roman epigraphics of antiquity. All these ideas were very welcomed from more than a decade from the French typography, and they were the core of the debates that would take place at the Rencontres de Lure. However, this situation will soon change, and the French market and some of the members of the École de Lure will start to think and act differently. The decline of the Graphie Latine started when all the international foundries, including the French ones, started to sell lineals and neo-grotesque typefaces, like Universe from Adrien Frutiger for de Berny-Peignot, 1957, Nord and Antique Olive de Roger Scoffon for la Fonderie Olive de Marseille, in 1958 and 1960, and Caravelle was actually Folia from Bauer, distributed from the Fonderie Typographique Française in 1960. But on another of the decisive signs of the decline of the movement was when Roger Scoffon assumed the direction of the Rencontres de Lure in 1963. From this moment, the debates focused on a new concept called by Scoffon himself as visualism. This concept emerged from the impact of advertising, photography, and the audiovisual media developed in those years. According to visualism, the letter should acquire a visual nature, at the same time should stay legible. Typography for reading books were no more the center of the debates, and new medias such as cinema and television took the main part of the interest. In order to conclude, and as one of the main objectives of this research is to place this movement in the history of typography, precisely because it was a movement that was in opposition to the dominant current of modern design. It's important to try to understand what was the real impact of this movement. Even though French advertising and graphic design were under the American and Swiss influence for more than a decade, they were the only line of typographic thought in France. Despite their universalist vision, their field of action was reduced to France. Hence, their position concerning Latinity had a very anecdotic influence in Spain and Italy. Even though the Rencontres de Lure hosted guests from other countries, the traditionalist position during Vox's era put them out of the international tendencies of the moment. Their constant opposition to anything that would come abroad from France isolated them ever more. Precisely in a moment where tendencies in the field of graphic design were more and more global due to the influence of the Swiss school. The typographic model of the incised, the glyphics, was reduced to a very specific context and very restricted at the age. Designers, as Adrian Frutiger, for instance, would consider then as a trick issue due to the needs of photocomposition. Despite the small impact they had and the way they isolate themselves, it's a movement that has its importance, as it has been one of the ones to go against majority tendencies at the age. For this, we owe them at least curiosity, and this is what pushed me to try to understand them. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, do we have any questions?